Sword and Shield era has been all over the place in the last few weeks, with booster boxes going out of stock on the Pokemon Center and prices from products almost doubling in value. I'm asking myself, are the top 10 chase cards from the Sword and Shield era still affordable, since prices of sealed products are becoming so expensive? Because if we go 1 year back in time, almost every alt art card from the Sword and Shield era was dropping in value. But times have definitely changed, so let's get right into it. So today we're gonna take a look at the 10 most expensive alt art cards out of the Sword and Shield era. So what information are we looking at? First of all, we have the price of a raw copy of this card. Next up we have the PSA 10 price. Of course we have the PSA report, how many PSA 10s there are actually today in the market. Also the PSA 10 ratio. And then how many percent this card increased, decreased over the last year. And then to end, we make a little comparison with the price of the booster box this card is actually coming from, and also how many percent this booster box increased or decreased in the last year. So let's start off with number 10, Espeon VMAX. The current price of a raw copy is $156. If you want to have this card in a PSA 10, you will need to pay around $300. If we take a look at the PSA report, there are approximately 5,000 PSA 10 copies of this card and a PSA 10 ratio of 66%. This card increased 3% over the last year. At number 9 is the Glaceon VMAX, beautiful cards. This card is going for $166 in a raw copy. If you want to have this card in a PSA 10, you will need to pay $282. The PSA report shows us that there are 4,900 PSA 10 copies of this card and a PSA 10 ratio of 76%. This card increased 18% over the last year. At number 8 we have the Lugia V from Silver Tempest, one of my favorite cards. I actually pulled one myself out of my first Silver Tempest booster box ever. It's currently at PSA for grading, so let's hope it's coming back as a 10 because this card is back up on the rise. You can pick up this card for $178 in a raw copy, $300 for a PSA 10 copy, and the PSA report shows us that there are 7,700 PSA 10 copies of this card and a PSA 10 ratio of 67%. This card increased 2% over the last year. And if we compare this with a booster box from Silver Tempest, this is only going for $140, which is pretty affordable. I think Silver Tempest is one of the last alt art sets out of the Sword and Shield era that is still pretty cheap. If you want to pick up a sealed booster box from one of the alt art sets out of the Sword and Shield era, I think Silver Tempest can be a good choice. Next up on our list, number 7, the beautiful Umbreon V out of Evolving Skies. This card exploded in value. You can pick up a raw copy of this card for $180, but this card increased 102% over the last year. A PSA 10 copy of this card is worth $300, and if we take a look at the PSA report, it shows us that there are 3,700 PSA 10 copies and a PSA 10 ratio of 57%. This card increased probably the most out of this top 10 list from the Sword and Shield era. At number 6, again an Evolving Skies card, the Leafeon VMAX, going for $194 in a raw copy. A PSA 10 copy of this card is worth $279. The PSA report shows us that there are 5,000 PSA 10 copies of this card and a PSA 10 ratio of 76%. This card increased 24% over the last year. At number 5, the beautiful Blaziken VMAX out of Chilling Rain. Very hard to pull, very difficult sets to pull big chase cards. This is actually one of my chase cards I want to pick up in a PSA 10. If you want to pick up this card in a raw copy, you will need to pay $223. A PSA 10 copy is worth $400, and the PSA report shows us that there are 2,795 PSA 10s, which is pretty low compared to other big chase cards out of the alt art sets from Sword and Shield, and the PSA 10 ratio is 70%. This card increased 11% over the last year, but same story as the other cards. First of all, in the previous year there was a big downwards trend, but in the last 2 months a big retracement happened. Compared to a Chilling Rain booster box going for $211, increased 51% over the last year, let's say in the last 2 months, because I think this booster box was going for $150, $160 till February 2024. At number 4, we got the big chase card out of Fusion Strike, the Gengar VMAX, going in a raw copy for $296. A PSA 10 copy of this card is worth $710 already. The PSA report shows us that there are 5,500 PSA 10 copies of this card and a PSA 10 ratio of 67%. This card increased 57% over the last year, compared to a Fusion Strike booster box already going for $240 because of the news last month that Fusion Strike booster boxes were out of stock on the Pokemon Center. This booster box increased 71% over the last year. Now it's getting pretty serious. We're entering the top 3 Altar chase cards out of the Sword and Shield era. At number 3, we got the Giratina V, the big chase card out of Lost Origin, going for $315 in a raw copy and $710 in a PSA 10 copy. The PSA report shows us that there are 4,000 PSA 10 copies of this card with a PSA 10 ratio of only 48%. So the PSA 10 copies of this card are pretty exclusive. A big surprise, but this card is the only card that decreased in value over the last year, 3% down. It may be a little bit confusing, but this card was actually worth $320 1 year ago. So the card is actually back where it was 1 year ago. A Lost Origin booster box is going for $177, increased 5% over the last year. This is actually a pretty small increasement because Lost Origin had one of the latest reprints out of the Sword and Shield era. And then at number 2, we got another Evolving Skies card, the Rayquaza VMAX, going for $322 in a raw copy and $557 in a PSA 10 copy. The report shows us that there are 7,100 PSA 10 copies of this card with a PSA 10 ratio of 74%. This card increased 34% in the last year. And last but not least, our big winner, of course, the Umbreon VMAX out of Evolving Skies with an insane value of $727 in a raw copy, and a PSA 10 copy is going for $1,161. The PSA report shows us that there are 10,800 PSA 10 copies, very big amount compared to, let's say, a Blaziken VMAX out of Chilling Reign, which is only 2,000 copies, and the PSA 10 ratio from the Umbreon is 75%. This card increased 12% over the last year. So these are the 10 most expensive cards out of the Sword and Shield era, but there are actually a couple of honorable mentions I want to share with you. First of all, we got the Sylveon VMAX out of Evolving Skies going for $153. We have the Galarian Moltres V coming out of Chilling Reign for $152. And then actually we have the big chase card out of Brilliant Stars, the beautiful Charizard V, going for only $137. And then my favorite card out of the Sword and Shield era, because this is my favorite Pokemon, the Dragonite V, coming out of Evolving Skies, going for $122 in a raw copy. And there you have an overview of the 10 most expensive cards out of the Sword and Shield era. Now, if you like this video and you want to win the Golden Mew from Celebrations, you just gotta leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you actually have one of those top 10 chase cards, or are you planning to pick up one of those? Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.